once again, thank you everybody for joining us this evening for our webinar. It's the next episode in our grassland management series, and today we're going to be focusing on grassland management for invertebrates. We're luckily got a guest speaker today, Rachel Richard, who's from Buglife. She is their beanlines officer, and I'm sure she'll tell you a bit more about that. She's got loads and loads of experience in the field, and we're really lucky to have her today. So the session's going to run, we're going to do about 45 minutes chatting. Rachel's going to do a presentation for us, and then the last little bit at the end of the session, we're going to have a Q&A. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Alternatively, you could jot them down your end and put your virtual hand up, and we can get to all your questions at the end. So yeah, we're going to have about 15 minutes for that. And then I'm going to round it up, telling everybody how you can get involved in Nidderdale. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you on to Rachel and take it away, please.
Okay, good evening. Hi. Thank you for joining us this evening. I saw some of you before you disappeared. I'm going to share my screen anyway and get started. So give me a tick. Okay, can you see that all right?
Yeah, we've got that. Great.
Excellent. I'm just going to move you out of my way because I've got you in my way on the screen.
Sorry.
So yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about managing grassland for pollinators and other beneficial inverts. But about half of this talk, I'm going to be talking about those invertebrates and their habitat requirements, just so we kind of understand a bit better what we're thinking about in terms of the management as well, what their needs are. There we go. So first of all, who are Buglife? So we're the only organisation in the UK and Europe who are concerned with the conservation of all invertebrates. So you've got there our vision and our mission statement. Obviously, there's an awful lot of them and a lot to work on. So we do this in different ways. So in our conservation work, we like to inspire others, sort of raise awareness of the needs of different invertebrates, feed into policy. We do a lot of practical conservation work, a lot of surveys, and we work on things like trying to reduce the use of pesticides and light pollution, water quality, you know, some of these big important issues that impact invertebrates and all of us, really. So yeah, check out our website if you want to know more about us. So the structure today, I'm going to talk first about pollinators and other beneficial invertebrates and how they benefit us. And then about managing grassland for invertebrates and what they need, their nesting habitat, their floral resources, etc. And I'll end with a little bit on beelines as well, what they are and how you can contribute to beelines. I'm gonna remove people from the corner of my screen so I can see better. 1 sec. No, that didn't work. Okay, moving on. So what benefits do invertebrates bring?
I don't think we've got the presentation now, Rachel.
Oh, is it not sharing anymore? Okay,
no.
1 sec. I was trying to get rid of... I'm just sharing again, it's just thinking about it.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, you got that?
Great. Yeah, perfect.
Good. Okay. So obviously we love invertebrates, you know, for their own intrinsic value, for their beauty and interest and the fun of, you know, watching a bumblebee in a meadow. But they also perform really important ecosystem services that not everyone's aware of. The one we are aware of is that they're the base of the food chain. They're food for everything else. So we see things like migratory insect-eating birds that have been really struggling. Well, you know, the invertebrates are their food and they need the right habitats and the right resources to do well. A lot of them are pollinators, so they're pollinating wild plants and crops, which is really, really important. But something called integrated pest management as well. So, you know, a lot of farmers will know what this means, but not everyone is necessarily. But it's having that correct balance of predatory species and pest species. So things like gardeners using ladybirds to eat aphids, and arable farmers having beetle banks. So you've got those beetles eating things like slugs and snails, things like predatory wasps as well, dealing with potentially pest species. So, having that semi-natural habitat that's good for invertebrates is also good for the farmer and managing potential pest insects as well. And they bring soil improvements. So they contribute to nutrient cycling. You think of worms and all the small microinvertebrates in the soil as well that are decomposing organic matter, recycling it through the soil, aerating the soil, making their burrows so that water can drain, basically making the soil better. So you need less costly inputs, so the fertilizers and what have you. So having an abundant invertebrate fauna indicates a healthy ecosystem. So, some people will complain when they see lots of flies everywhere. I think it's a great thing. And it means that the environment is healthier, especially if there is a diversity of different species. So our pollinators to start with, we reckon we have at least 4,000 species in the UK. And those images just represent the main pollinating groups. So you've got a hoverfly there, top left, but all flies do carry out some pollination. So they're not collecting and carrying pollen like a bee would be. So they're perhaps not transferring as much per individual fly. But if you think about the abundance of flies, you walk through a meadow in the summer, and on the buttercups, you'll see lots of these yellow dung flies, Sacrophaga, and they're feeding on flowers and they're very hairy. They pick up pollen, they move to another flower, they are pollinating. So even though it's small amounts of pollen, the quantity of those flies means that they are having a significant contribution to pollination. And a lot of plants are actually fly pollinated. You think of chocolate, the cocoa plant is pollinated by a midge. And there's lots of smaller plants as well that are pollinated by flies. In the top middle, you've got solitary bees. We'll talk about solitary bees a little bit more in a minute, but we have around 250 species of those in the UK, so important pollinators. You've got solitary wasp. People often say, what's the point in wasps? They get wound up about wasps coming near their beer. But wasps do two things. Obviously, they're part of the food chain. A lot of them are predatory. There's not just the social black and yellow wasps that we all know. There's a lot of different solitary wasps that specialize on eating different invertebrates. An abundance and a diversity of those means a healthy ecosystem, and it means their food and the predator-prey relationship is balanced. But they're predators, but they are also pollinators. They also visit plants to nectar and thereby pick up a bit of pollen, not a lot. They're not very hairy, they're not as good as bees, but they are transferring pollen as well. And the social wasps are quite hairy. Then we've got our butterflies and moths, Lepidoptera. Everybody loves them. They're not the best pollinators. Again, they're not collecting pollen. They're not especially hairy, but they transfer a small amount of pollen, and they've got a long tongue, so they can get into deeper flowers, things like honeysuckle. Then we've got our bumblebees. We'll talk about them a bit more shortly. Good, strong pollinators, travel long distances, very cold resilient, and beetles. Beetles, not all beetles, but a lot of beetles are flower visiting, so they will pick up pollen and transfer it. They're feeding on nectar. They're also predating other insects, often on flowers. And that's just an image of some of the bees in the UK. It just shows a little bit of the diversity. And you've got honeybees on there as well, which I haven't mentioned. But yeah, around a load of solitary bees and bumblebees. So we'll have a little bit more of a look at bees just now. So our bumblebees, we have 24 species in the UK, and 6 of those are cuckoo bumblebees. So cuckoo bumblebees, as the name suggests, they actually lay their eggs, they parasitize, as it were, the nest of social bumblebees. So they go into the nest and they will either kill the queen or take over her nest. So they only have males and females. They don't have workers. But I'll go through the bumblebee life cycle shortly and it'll make more sense. So bumblebees in general visit twice as many flowers per minute as honeybees. So they're very good pollinators. They can make quite long foraging trips. They're quite big. They're quite cold resilient. They'll travel 1 kilometre or more from a nest if need be, if if the food is close to the nest, then they're not going to go further, and they're going to do better because they're not wasting so much energy traveling. And they do something called buzz pollination, which a number of solitary bees do as well, where they use a sonic vibration to get the plant to release its pollen. So things like tomato, kiwi, aubergine, those plants there, which are important commercial crops, actually require buzz pollination to properly release their pollen and be pollinated. So bumblebees and some solitary bees do that, but honeybees don't. So just to help you understand a bit more like bumblebees and their needs in the landscape and in grassland, just going to go through the life cycle very quickly. So the queen comes out of hibernation in the spring. So, around March time, late February to April, the queen's coming out from hibernation. They've already been mated. They're hungry. They need nectar and they need pollen. So pollinators need both of those things. The pollen is for growing her ovaries, and for feeding her young, and the nectar is her own sort of energy drink. And willow that you see there is a really important plant in the spring that they often go to. And that you can see a bee there that's got pollen collected on its back legs. But they will then be nest searching. So when you first see bumblebees in the spring, you'll often see them zigzagging around on the ground, going into little holes and out again into tussocks of grass, and they're checking out potential nest sites. They're like quite sunny nest sites. Some bumblebees nest under the ground in small mammal holes. Some nest in tussocky grasses. Some nest in holes in trees. But you can observe this behavior and see the sort of habitat that they like. So that tussocky grassland is important. Those sunny banks with small mammal holes are important. That's nesting habitat for bumblebees. Once they found a site, they lay their eggs. They actually sit on, they make a little mass of pollen that they sit on. They make a little honey pot. So they actually create their own little sort of nectary honey pot on a little wax structure, so they can feed themselves while they incubate their eggs. So they actually sit on their eggs like a bird does and incubate them. And they will raise their first batch of workers. The workers are also females, basically a smaller version of the queen that can't produce its own young. So you've got the queen that produces the young, you've got the female workers. And through the season, the workers will go out and forage. The queen will keep producing more workers and largely stay in the nest later in the season. So you'll go from seeing queens looking for nests, queens collecting, to workers out and about collecting. If you see a bee with pollen on its legs, you know you've got a female bee. And it's only female bees and wasps that sting as well. So through the season, there's your little bumblebee nest there. You can see some workers and some eggs. And if the weather is decent, if there is sufficient food, then that nest will get bigger and bigger and will produce between 50 and 400 workers, just depending on the species. Some species have bigger nests than others, and depending on the weather and the food availability. At the end of the season, the queen will die, the workers will die, and the queen will have fed some of her larvae slightly more food so that she then produces new queens and males, and those new queens and males will disperse from their nest and find a partner to mate with, ideally not from the same nest, because they should be spreading out and spreading their genetics around. So you've then got the new queen, different actual species here in this image, just forgive that, but the new queen has been mated. The rest of the bees from the nest have died, and the number of mated new queens is an indication of the success of that bee nest, really, or that bee colony. That mated queen will then look for a hibernation site. And for a hibernation site, they prefer somewhere shadier, somewhere that's not going to warm up, on every sunny day and wake them up from hibernation. So often in plant pots or under hedgerows or a shady bank, those sorts of areas, they'll hibernate. So the things that we're thinking of for bumblebees in habitat is they need forage, and they need it from the spring through the summer, late into the summer. They need it connected, not a nice patch miles away and another nice patch here, but forage that they can access without wasting too much energy. They need nest sites, and they need hibernation sites. So those are the things that are important with bumblebees. My cursor doesn't like to move on. So there we go, hibernation sites. So feeding requirements for bumblebees: an unbroken supply of food, nectar and pollen sources. So if you really watch bumblebees and other insects, you'll see often they're just nectaring. There's no pollen on their back legs. They're not wiggling their back legs around. They're actually feeding on nectar on that particular plant. On another plant, you might see them covered in pollen, some pollen on their head or on their back legs, and you'll see them sort of vibrating their legs around or rubbing it onto their legs. So it's worth observing in your gardens or, you know, on your land, which plants are the bumblebees and other insects actually using and collecting from, and you can encourage the spread of those plants, you know, if you want to support these invertebrates on your land. And I've just got about tongue length there. So different bumblebees have got different tongue lengths. So some prefer deep flowers, some more shallow flowers, and they're central place foragers, like we were saying. So they're traveling out from the nest, and ideally they don't want to be going too far to get their food. So having that connected habitat around nesting sites is important. Sorry, drink 1 minute. So solitary bees, we have around 250 species. Some nest in the ground and some are aerial nesters, so nesting in holes in deadwood and the like, sort of beetle holes. And they carry the pollen quite loosely on their body. You can see the leaf cutter there, that big one on the purple flower. It's got the pollen underneath on the hairs of its abdomen there. But a lot of solitary bees are carrying it on their back legs. And again, if you ever see a bee with pollen, you know you've got a female bee. But because they're carrying it externally, or at least most of them are, they're quite messy pollinators, so they're quite good pollinators. So this is just showing the nesting habitat. It's a piece of wood with holes drilled in it. So you get ground nesters and aerials. So this is the aerial nesters here in this image. And the leaf cutters actually cut little sections of leaf. You can see them flying around carrying them. It's quite cool. And they'll sort of weave that around. I'll go through the life cycle shortly. But solitary bees are not always entirely solitary, in that sometimes you'll have like a nesting aggregation, so an area where there's lots and lots of holes together. So each bee's got its own hole, but they're nesting sort of, you know, in a housing estate, as it were. Others, you'll get one hole and they'll have side tunnels off. So like chocolate mining bee, you'll sometimes find them in walls and you'll see a number of bees going in the same hole, but they're using different side tunnels. Others are actually what's called eusocial. So they have a worker class, a bit like bumblebees, but the worker looks almost, well, actually identical to the reproductive female. So you can't actually tell them apart, but those workers are doing a job like perhaps sitting at the entrance of the hole and making sure no parasites come in. So sort of guarding and helping with that. Many solitary bees have different seasons. So you get species that come out in the spring, species that come out in the summer, species that are late in the summer, often timed with the plants that they feed from. And some where you have a spring generation and a later summer generation, and they actually have slightly different colour forms then as well. So it's just interesting to know, you know, if you have a bee bank or an area where they're nesting, it might be that particular area is popular in the spring and another area might be popular in the summer, especially if your spring bank is in a shaded location by a river, for example, where the spring, it might be quite sunny, but later in the summer it's so shaded, no solitary bee is going to nest there. So it's just noticing how habitat is used and when it's used so that you can kind of support that and look after that. So their life cycle there, but that's a red mason bee. So that's one of the commonest bees that people have in bee hotels. So you can see in the spring, you've got the bees emerging from their nest, and you tend to get males. With most solitary bees, the males emerge first, often a week or two before the females, and they'll be patrolling around, looking for a mate, often jumping on something which is the wrong species. You know, they'll jump on hoverflies and things on flowers just to give it a go. And then when the females emerge, obviously they're mating with the females. The female will then collect pollen. She will find a new nest site. She'll go in, leave her pollen in a little sort of ball with some nectar and lay her egg there and then seal up her cell. And red mason bees collect mud and they'll sort of dampen it and seal it up with that. So if it's very dry weather and you've got red mason bees, it's worth watering patches of ground so they can actually get the wet mud to clog it up. makes life a bit easier for them, and you can see them coming down and collecting it. They've got little horns on their head, and they collect the mud there. They kind of carry it on their horns. But that's the kind of general life cycle of solitary bees. And hoverflies. So hoverflies are pollinators, and many of them are also predators in terms of the larvae of a lot of hoverflies feed on aphids and plant lice and other predatory insects. So they're great pest controllers as well. So having that semi-natural habitat that supports the pollinators also helps to control species that can become a problem, especially in horticulture or arable farms. Not so much on grassland, but it's good to have the habitat for these species anyway. It's just not clicking on. There we go. So other beneficials, we've got some ground beetles there, parasitic wasp, ladybird. I'm just going to talk a bit more about some other beneficial. So yeah, a particular relevance to grassland, of course, and anyone who's a livestock farmer is dung beetles. There's an organisation called Dung Beetles for Farmers, which is really worth looking up. They've got some great resources. But dung beetles really support good, healthy soils. They're really good for soils. And when we started cattle farming in Australia, whenever that was, I don't remember dates, we took a load of cattle over there, started really large scale ranching, and realised that nothing was happening with the dung. We were getting this dung build up, which is obviously fouling pasture and reducing the grazing potential because they didn't have the dung beetles. They didn't have dung beetles that would deal with, cow dung. So they had to then actually introduce dung beetles as well to try and deal with that dung, because they realised just how important they were, because that dung was just standing and obviously releasing methane, reducing the grazing capacity. So what dung beetles do is, they return in good pasture conditions, they will actually return the dung to the ground in 24 hours. So they dig down through the dung, they can go down to about 1 meter in depth. So their tunnels, they're kind of mixing the soil, they're taking the dung down, they're producing, well, the tunnels mean that water drains, that nutrients move around. So they're really, really beneficial for the soil health, but they're also reducing the fouling. And then that structure, like I've said, increases water infiltration. And they also reduce the parasite burden in livestock. So they do that a number of ways. They compete with various problematic flies like face fly for feeding in the dung. So they reduce the fly burden in dung of flies that are a problem to livestock. They carry a phoretic mite between dung, and that mite also feeds on the eggs of worms, so they reduce the worm burden. So they're reducing the worm burden, and they're reducing fly issues from dung as well by just sort of turning it over, getting into the soil, and competing with other insects for the dung. So yeah, we would encourage you where possible to sort of reduce the use of worming meds with cattle. So try and do it in a as you need it fashion, rather than a lot of us are the same, to be fair, with pets. A lot of people are worming dogs and cats and things, as our vets suggest we should do, every 3 months or so, and it's really not necessary. It's a case of using worming meds if and when you need it for animal welfare reasons. So if you can, looking at fecal egg counts, seeing when it is becoming an issue in cattle and using it then, but not doing it in a routine fashion. So you're reducing the cost of the treatments. Obviously you do need to pay for the fecal egg counts, but there's other things that you can do there in terms of what's in the pasture. So if you have used worming meds as well, it's a case of not putting your cattle then straight out onto your most species rich pastures, but using a sacrificial area or a sort of poorer quality pasture to put them out on for sort of 10 days or so before you then put them out onto the species rich grassland, so that you've still got those dung beetles and all the biodiversity that goes with that in your species rich pasture. But you can use things like poultry integration. So some people have sort of laying hens that follow after the cattle have grazed, and the hens are then pecking things out of the dung as well, so reducing that worm burden as well. And then, of course, there are wild plants that have natural alpha-mintic properties, so things like cinquefoil and birdsfoot trefoil and chicory. So having a diverse sward, whether you've got a herbal ley that you've put in, or whether you've got species-rich grassland that's got diverse plants in it, can help to naturally reduce that worm burden in cattle as well. So on to a bit more about actually managing grassland for invertebrates and what invertebrates need with that. I've put that image on, I guess, because a lot of people would look at that and think, well, that's a bit of a mess. Someone's kind of, made a mess there. But an entomologist would look at that and go, that's interesting, because you've got such a variety of structure there. So you've got bushes, you've got trees in the background, you've got long grass, you've got short grass, you've got bare ground, you've got slopes. So that bare area is the kind of place where a lot of invertebrates will nest or bask. It's very important nesting and basking habitat. You've got a lot of different flowers for pollen and nectar. So with invertebrates, you're kind of thinking on a different scale. You're thinking in miniature. You think about yourself, if you go to the beach on a sunny day and it's blowing a gale, well, you'll sit behind a wall or in the sand dunes or somewhere where you can get a bit of shelter. So for invertebrates, most of which are cold-blooded, they're always looking for those sort of sheltered areas to warm their bodies up and get going. And in terms of nesting as well, it's so much warmer. It means on a slightly warm day, they can warm up enough to get out and get going and go and get some food. So microclimates are really important. Structure, variety of plants, like I've said, from early to late. Variety, because different pollinators have got different tongue lengths and have different plant preferences. Solitary bees and hoverflies like shallow flowers, bumblebees like deep flowers, the long-tongued bumblebees like even deeper flowers, butterflies like deep flowers. So it's that variety. So species-rich grassland is fantastic because in sort of native species-rich grassland, you're getting spring flowering plants, you're getting flowers right through the summer, and you're getting things in the autumn as well, and you're getting a variety of flower shapes and structures. And you're thinking about not just the adult plant food, so not just, the pollen and the nectar. For the adults, you're thinking about the larval food plants. So some people put in wildflower mixes, it's 100% flowers, no grasses. Well, you're not going to get a lot of the butterflies and moths. So a lot of them, their larvae are feeding on their caterpillars are feeding on grasses. So the grasses are really important as well. And of course, we're interested in all invertebrates, and they need that sort of more natural structure and habitat that has grasses in it. So onto the species-rich grassland. I know you've already had talks on this, so I won't go into it too much. But if you're a farmer and you have species-rich grassland, really value that. It's a really important habitat, and thank you for looking after that. I know there's been a lot of pressures on doing other more profitable things with it over time. So yeah, value and protect that habitat. And if you've been managing it well for years, keep doing what you're doing. You're obviously doing it right. But it's having that late summer cut, so you allow things to flower and set seed. You can also vary the time a little bit. So if you've got a meadow that's, for example, largely dominated by knapweed, and you want some of the other plants to do a bit better, rather than always doing such a late cut a little bit early one year, so that your knapweed hasn't all gone to seed and you're catching maybe more of the seeds of other things. So you don't always have to do exactly the same time. Obviously, with agri-environment, you may have time limits on it, but you can vary a little bit if you want to try and change the botanical structure or encourage a few other plants if there are particular things that are taking over. You can do things like using temporary fencing. So if you've got an area that is being grazed quite a lot, but you've got, I don't know, a wet flush at the bottom where there's a lot of orchids and interesting things, you might use temporary electric fencing just to fence an area off for the middle of the summer to let those things sort of flourish a little bit more. And you can, move this temporary fencing around even, have a strip of, if you're grazing an area, have a strip protected and protect another strip later on in the year. Things like rotational grazing can be really good. So mob grazing and pulse grazing. So the cattle are always getting fresh forage, but you've also always got areas that are flowering. So you've got the flower resources and the forage for the animals. But obviously you need to have the infrastructure to be able to do that. And like I said, you can leave cut strips on rotation. So with a meadow, you know, when you do cut a hay meadow, the entire resource is gone if you cut the entire meadow. So it's quite good to leave a strip, if you can, just along one side uncut, and you perhaps rotate that another year. So you leave another strip another year. So you've still got that bit of resource and also an area that can become overwintering habitat as well. Of course, when you do cut a meadow, as you would with a traditional meadow, you take the hay off and you remove that. So if you know, if you're just managing an area for wildlife and you're not farming it, you still need to take that hay cut off, take that vegetation off. Otherwise, the nutrients are going back into the soil. You don't want that with species-rich grassland. You want low nutrients. And where possible, you know, try and look at creating or restoring flower-rich grassland. So if you've got a species poor pasture or it's moderately species rich, there's lots of different ways to enhance it. And I think you've probably covered that in other talks, but you can use things like green hay or brush harvested seed. So that means it's seed that's coming from another local meadow, which is going to take well in your soil and your climate, your environment, and have the plants that your local pollinators are used to. So that's the best way of doing it if you can. And then, of course, with your managing, I've said, you know, you allow it to flower and set seed before you cut, ideally, unless you're trying to change the composition a little bit and cut some before they've seeded too much. So, and then tussocky areas. So when we were talking about bumblebee nesting habitat, this tussocky grassland is a really important nesting habitat for things like common carder, but it's also overwintering for spiders and bugs and grasshoppers and all sorts of things. So it's good to have some of those uncut tussocky areas as well, but cut those on rotation. So that might be one of your field margins or a track edge. So you might leave that for a couple of years and then cut it, but ensuring that you always have that tussocky grassland somewhere on site. And in a sunny location is good for the nesting habitat, and shadier locations can be good for overwintering. But it's the sort of microclimate that you get in that tussocky habitat that's really important. So I don't know how relevant this is to all farmers, but you can see some of these slides have come from I've used in other talks. But this kind of short grassland, I think a lot of people have it along track entrances, around farm buildings. You know, if you're involved with any amenity space, there's just no need to cut it really regularly and really short. So if you want to support this as a picture of a park, you know, and the council have just cut it right back, all of it, where you could easily have some long margins there. But the other thing that is available if you're interested in creating habitat, and you can use if you have a species poor road verge, is you can buy these short lawn mixes that have things like bird's foot trefoil and clovers and self-heal and cat's ear. If you already have things in the sward, it's just a case of cutting it slightly less and cutting it a bit longer. So you may be cutting to like 5 centimeters rather than right down to the ground, 5 or 6 centimeters, and cutting maybe every sort of 3 or 4 weeks. And you can have a really flower-rich lawn, but still have a tidy area if it's an area that you want to look neat and tidy around sort of buildings or whatever. And then just sort of weedy field corners and edges and track edges and things. So I think people often really undervalue weeds. You know, it's in the name, we kind of think of it as a bad thing. We prefer not to use the term weed because they are ultimately wildflowers. So things like thistles, docks, not so much, I guess I'm thinking more about flowers for pollinators. But thistles are fantastic, teasels, willow herbs, umbellifers, these plants that people often think of as weeds that are wildflowers, which actually support a huge diversity and abundance of wild pollinators. So you might not want, obviously, your whole field taken over with something like creeping thistle, which can be a real problem. But if you can leave patches in some areas, and if you are controlling them, try to do it without herbicides. So top them, you know, before they go to seed, you know, maybe let some flower and top them before they go to seed so they're not spreading too much. But there's a paper, a study that was done called The Disproportionate Value of Weeds, and the study compared pollinator mixes with the injurious weeds in terms of how much insects use them. And I think there was twice as much in terms of abundance and diversity on the weed species, because basically our wild pollinators have adapted to those plants. and a lot of them are very nectar rich, so definitely not to be undervalued. And then just onto rough grassland and rushes. So yeah, a lot of these areas require a certain amount of grazing, and I guess it's all about trying to get the grazing levels right. So again, avoiding the worming meds in livestock if you can, so you're not getting that chemical input. But it's extensive rather than intensive grazing. So it's trying to get the grazing levels right, so you're still allowing plants to flower. And yeah, it's enough grazing to kind of keep the rushes down in areas where you don't want to lose that grazing value, but still allow things to flower. And it may be a case of fencing off or using temporary fencing again on sort of sensitive or species rich areas of that. Things like scrapes, creating scrapes for wetland birds and waders can be really good. Also, obviously, beneficial to a lot of invertebrate species, things like dragonflies and a lot of hoverflies as well. A lot of their larvae need wet habitats. So those wet habitats, especially seasonal pools, that dry up in the summer. So things like dragonflies get on really well with those. And yeah, even things like newts, not invertebrates, but a lot. You're always really going to increase the wildlife by putting in scrapes and wet features. And then scrub mosaic. So in conservation, we're always trying to get the right balance, and obviously in grazing, it's going to be the same because you want, the grass for the livestock, but some scattered scrub actually creates a really valuable habitat for invertebrates. So it's not just about the flowers, the pollen and nectar, obviously, for invertebrates on grasses and flowers in grassland, I'm trying to say, but shrubs, so hedgerows, scattered shrubs and trees. Many of these are important flower resources as well for pollinators. So the spring flowering sequence in a hedgerow from blackthorn, hawthorn, crabapple, willow, all of these plants are really important to pollinators as well. So having some scrub and having some scrub grassland mosaic, it's a very valuable habitat for pollinators to try and have some on site if you can, but it's keeping that balance, isn't it? So the scrub doesn't actually take over in the grassland. And again, we would encourage trying to manage it without herbicides. So, it's getting the grazers in at the right time if it's starting to scrub up. So sort of late summer. Yeah, sort of ponies and hardy cattle can be really good at sort of knocking scrub back. A little bit more on wet habitats. We've mentioned them previously in scrapes, but a farmland pond can be just amazing for wildlife, for all wildlife, but invertebrates in particular. And there's some, I don't know if you've come across them. There's something called ghost ponds. You can use very old maps and find out where the ponds used to be. Probably not so relevant to upland. It's probably more of a lowland thing where more of the wet features have been lost from farms, but it's a thing where people sort of locate old ponds and then redig them in the same spot, because much of the life, the seed from the wetland plants that were once there, and even some of the invertebrate life can actually remain in the soil for a very long time. And so digging a new pond on an old site can actually be colonized a lot quicker and become more diverse. So that's a good thing to look into. So ponds and ditches and watercourses, they're a great source of pollen and nectar. Obviously, you often get things like purple loosestrife and what's it called, Philopendula. Forgotten the common name of it. Marsh marigolds, mints. There's a lot of aquatic plants that are really good for pollinators, but a lot of hoverflies as well lay their eggs in ponds. And obviously dragonflies and damselflies and all sorts of things. So they're a really great habitat. You then get all the invertebrates around it, and then you've got all your swifts and swallows and things feeding around it as well. Are you all right there? Someone came on. But it's with the wet features, it's trying to, you don't want trees taking around all of the edges and shading the whole thing. It's quite good maybe to have trees or shrubs on one side, but having part of the pond with a sunny aspect as well. So you've got a sunny side and a shady side. You've got more different microhabitats there that way.
And if you need to manage them, cut back some of the trees, you do that on rotation, so you're not removing all of it on 1 year. And similarly, if you've got livestock that are drinking from a pond or a water course, it's allowing them access at a limited place, so they're not sort of damaging the whole edge of the pond or the water course. So it's fencing off some of it and just allowing a certain amount of access. And yeah, just some of the plants there that are good. So I think it was meadowsweet I was trying to say before, actually. You start feeling like you're talking to yourself on these things. So nesting habitat, just quickly, you can see in that.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
Oh, thank you. It's weird when you can't see anybody.
Yeah.
So you can see a bit of nesting habitat there. So a lot of people might just see that and think, oh, the bank's a little bit damaged, we need to fix that. But that is the kind of place where a lot of ground nesting solitary bees will nest. So bees, wasps, their parasites, beetles, all sorts of things you'll find there. So you find things like bee flies as well. And I think I mentioned earlier with cuckoos, you have cuckoo bumblebees, you also have cuckoo solitary bees. So if you have a nesting site like that and there's a load of holes and bees going in and out, you'll have their little cuckoos following them around as well. So you get blood bees and nomads. Look a bit like wasps. Blood bees are red, nothing to do with blood, just red. And nomads are black and yellow, sometimes black and yellow and red. And they will pop into the nest of solitary bees when the solitary bees are out. Although blood bees sometimes even pull the solitary bees out, they'll pop in and lay their eggs and kill the egg of the host. So a bit like, like a cuckoo bee, really. And because they're not needing to collect pollen, they're not very hairy bees, so they're quite wasp-like. So if you see these things kind of hovering around a bank, the chances are you've got solitary bees nesting in there, and these are the cuckoos kind of checking it out. Many solitary bees don't travel very far, so they'll be foraging often within just a few hundred meters of the nest site. So if you've got these nesting features, it's worth trying to make sure there's wildflowers and shrubs and things that they can feed from in the vicinity as well. And you can create nesting habitat on farm as well. Some farmers do this if they find it's lacking. So it's good to have a walk around, in light of this, and see if you can find these features where bees are nesting, and help to keep them open. Don't let them scrub over too much. If you can't find any features like this, you can create them on farm as well, and they can be really valuable habitat. So that's in the process of making one, and that's an old one that needs a little bit of vegetation clearance. But there were bees and butterflies and beetles and things all over that bank. It's a really, really good habitat. Quite fun to make. So I've almost finished. I'm just gonna tell you about beelines now very quickly. So I'm beelines officer for Buglife. Beelines are basically like insect superhighways that we have mapped right across the UK. They're 3-kilometre wide corridors. The idea being to have stepping stones of flower-rich habitat in those corridors, sort of connecting up the UK. So in each county, there's a roughly north, south, east, west corridor, and it's a way of trying to prioritise habitat for pollinators. So this map is an interactive map that anyone can go onto. So you can add your species-rich past meadows on there. You can add species-rich hedgerows. Really any habitat that you're trying to manage well for pollinators. Orchards are great, wetlands, but habitats where you are trying to keep these flower rich and you're thinking about pollinators in the way that you're managing the habitat. So you can go onto our website, look up beelines and zoom into this interactive map, and just use the add site button there to put on your habitats, your species rich hedgerows, grassland, wetland, orchards. Even if you're a gardener and you've got a pollinator friendly garden, you can put that on, or a village green or a community project. All of these things can go onto the map, and it's a way of encouraging more people to do more, so people can go on and see what's happening in their area. And it's also a way for us to kind of gather more information on who is managing habitats for pollinators, and we use it in our project work as well. So we have a number of beelines projects around the UK, where we're working with landowners, community groups, councils, all sorts, to try and manage habitats better for pollinators. So just a few, to summarize, a few actions for pollinators. So creating and managing flower-rich areas We've been talking about grassland, which is a really important habitat, but also trying to look at the connectivity of habitat on a farm. So if you've got a good meadow, and there's another good meadow, I don't know, a few fields over, can you connect it up somehow with a margin or a hedgerow or other good habitat? So you've got that connectivity of good habitat across the farm. Do have a look on the beelines map and see if you can add your areas onto the beelines map. Think about nesting and overwintering habitats. So it's not just flowers, but it's where are they nesting, where are they overwintering, what can we do to help with that? Didn't talk much about dead wood, but dead wood is really important for a lot of invertebrates, for beetles, wasps, bees, for nesting habitats. So leaving that in the sun in places, but also standing dead wood, really valuable habitats. And then think about things like pollution. So trying to minimize the use of any pesticides and vet meds. And light pollution, I didn't really touch on, but that can be obviously for nocturnal insects, light pollution can be quite an issue. So if you've got lights on in farm buildings and things, have them on timers or have them directional, so you're reducing that light pollution. It attracts all the insects. It then attracts all the bats and things that are eating them. It can affect their migration because it confuses them, so they're not migrating properly. It can affect their breeding because they're not finding their mates properly. They're just going round and round a light, all confused. So it actually has quite big impacts, light pollution. So for homeowners, farmers, it's pull the curtains at night time, reduce the outside lights, have directional lights on timers, that kind of thing. And then I haven't really mentioned it too much, but with honeybees as well, it's just being aware that there is competition between wild bees and honeybees. So it's be aware of not overpopulating areas with hives, especially, if there is limited forage, if you're bringing hives in, you could be actually increasing the competition for food resources for wild pollinators, and there can also be some disease transfer. So it's making sure there's enough forage when you've got honeybees. And then just, I'm not going to read all of this, but just a little bit about Buglife and why support Buglife. Obviously why invertebrates are so important. And if you do wish to become a member and join, these are some of the things that you get with Buglife. So yeah, have a look on our website. There's a lot of resources, whether you're a member or not, that you can use. We've got a farming for pollinator resource that I'm sure we can share. And lots of things on our website as well. I can point you in the right direction and give you some links. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people again. I'm not sure how long I've been, because I think we started earlier, didn't we?
We've got 12 minutes left
Okay.
for questions. So Rachel, that was brilliant. So informative. Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Another thing I should mention, in case you're not aware of them, because I'm actually away from today because I was at a Nature Friendly Farming Network meeting. So if you're not familiar with them, I'll stick their link in the website as well. But they're a great organization to look up and to join. It's free membership. So, if you're a nature friendly farmer, then join more farmers and find out, share what you're learning with them. And so I'll stick that in the chat.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to share any resources to everybody who's attended and bought a ticket through our feedback form email, and that our comms officer will send out. So yeah, we've got 11 minutes for questions. Has anybody got any burning questions they want to ask? Please put your virtual hands up. Joe, fire away.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really good. I really enjoyed that. I was just wondering about beetles, and obviously you had some of the slides up about them, but thinking about obviously the dung beetles are kind of the ecosystem engineers or whatever the term is. But if there's any other beetles particularly that really stand out, there's some indicators.
Yeah. For arable farmers, it's often ground beetles. But there's this oil beetles. Have you come across oil beetles?
They're the big chunky ones.
Yeah, the big chunky ones. So they're really cool, and some of them are quite rare, and we do some work on them. So they actually, do you know about their life cycle?
Just that they do things to bees and
Yeah, so their little larvae are called triangulum, and their larvae hitchhike on solitary bees into solitary bee nests. So they're also found in association with nesting solitary bees. So they're really good ones to look out for. And if you find them, just, you know, make sure get a good picture and work out which species you've got, because you know, some are rarer than others, and it's good to get the records of where they are. So they're worth looking out for. And you know, in general, people think of parasites as bad things, but in ecology, you know, obviously we don't, because you need to have a healthy population of something to have the parasites. So getting those parasites is generally a good indication. So cuckoo bees, and oil beetles, you know, when you find them, it's a good thing. Obviously they don't want to annihilate their host, do they? So you know that they don't do that. They're there when there is a good population for them to be with. So
Yeah,
yeah,
thank you.
so yeah, I think
just
what else I mean, there's, you know, I'm not a beetle expert, but there is no end of beetles to look at if you like beetles. But
Yeah.
in what context are you asking about beetles?
So I work for an organisation that gets a lot of farms doing lots of soil sampling. And
You
we were
work
thinking
for,
about,
sorry?
I work for Farm Carbon Toolkit. We do a lot of soil sampling, and we were just talking about what kinds of indicate, apart from earthworms, but when we're out in the field, what kinds of things we can use as proxies for sort of soil health. And yeah, so I was just interested. I don't really know that much.
Well, there's worms,
That's
I
it.
guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, but soil health, yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's things like, you know, there's indicators of old grassland in terms of the plant species that you find, but things like chimney sweep, moth, but you tend to find that when there's a lot of pignut, you tend to find pignut when it's quite old pasture. So that, you know, there's things like that. So often plants are good indications really of, but that's often the age of the pasture and the fact that it hasn't been improved or disturbed.
Yeah.
Wax caps, if you know about wax caps, but that's not, again, it's not so much the necessarily the soil health, but it's that it hasn't had any inputs or ploughing. So, but yeah, in terms of upland grassland, wax caps are good for, you know, showing that the soil health hasn't been damaged.
Thank you. Very good talk.
Yeah.
I have a question if no one else has straight away. Oh no, Elizabeth, I'll let you go first. You're just on mute.
Hi, yeah, I'm just the only person at home, but very interested in what you're trying to achieve. And I think my interest in that sort of area is about kind of the new builds. And when you look around Harrogate, you know, these massive swathes of houses that are being built and taking off over quite what were probably quite wild places. So, you know, what sort of influence can or do you have in influencing these developments to make sure? Because when you look at the planting is really bland. It's not thought about, you know, the spaces and the distances. You know, looking at that beeline, you know, do you have any influence on making those areas better connected to what you're talking about today?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, it depends where it is. I have colleagues that get involved a lot with like designated sites when there are potential impacts. They do a lot of policy work, but not so much with housing developments. But if there is an important area for invertebrates, someone wants to get a golf course in there, yeah, we've got involved in a lot of situations like that and managed to stop developments from progressing. Yeah, it's not my particular area, but I do have colleagues that do a lot of work in that. But in terms of like housing developments and things, you know, there's a lot of yeah, I mean, it's a really hard thing at the moment, but there's a lot of room for trying to push for good habitat to go in as part of those developments. And Martin Lyons from Nature Friendly Farming Network today was saying he's been pushing the local councillor to, you know, even work with farmers to create that local green hay to then use in neighbouring developments. So, you know, they're losing farmland to developments. Well, they might as well work with the farmers as well to, you know, make sure there is some nice species rich grassland around those farmland, those developments. So, you know, he's trying to do things like that.
Great question, Elizabeth. Thanks. I suppose you could just do as much as you can in your own garden as well to try and if you're part of that new development, I've got
I-
just, oh, sorry, I've just got a quick question and then we're actually going to have to end the session. My question is, so in a woodland setting, yeah, the oak tree is really great for really great for invertebrates. It supports a whole host of invertebrates, more than any other tree. In a grassland setting, is there a flower and or grass that you could say is like the best of the best that supports the most invertebrates, whether it be its pollen resources or its ability for invertebrates to overwinter in it? I don't know. Could you give us, if we're working on a shoestring budget, and for me as well, for knowing what species to add for enhancement sites, for example, not just for looking at the plant diversity, but the invertebrates. Can you think of one flower and one grass that is the top dog? No easy questions here.
No, because it's more about diversity than one flower,
Okay.
really. But yeah, I mean, a tree is a whole ecosystem, isn't it? More than an individual plant would be. So I don't know that it's comparable. In a grassland, it's a community of plants. So the more diverse the community, the better. There are plants that are, very popular with pollinators at different times of the year. So with bumblebees, legumes are really important. So your clovers and your vetches and birds foot trefoil. So the pollen in clovers, just like legumes are very protein rich for us, the pollen is very protein rich for bumblebees. But you want your shallow open flowers for smaller pollinators. So a lot of the umbellifers. So in wetland, things like Angelica is really popular with solitary bees and hoverflies and also quite a few beetles. So, I would always go to Angelica to check it out. It's a really good plant. Purple loosestrife is very popular with bees. Mint is very popular with bees. Knapweed is popular with a lot of bees, but it's a deep flower, so you'll get leaf cutters and bumblebees and things. But solitary bees more likely on smaller, more shallow flowers. In gardens, things like alliums are really popular with, and chives very popular with some of the solitary bees. There isn't, no, that for grassland, obviously, a acidic grassland is going to be different to a chalk grassland in terms of the plants as well. But yeah, things like scabiouses are very popular as well with pollinators. Yarrow is lovely in sort of short lawn areas. A lot of the solitary bees love yarrow. So there's a whole bunch of plants that I would go towards. Ragwort, I didn't mention it earlier with the weeds, but it has a very high diversity of insects that love ragwort. So although you don't want it taking over in a horse field, it's actually received a lot more bad press than it should, because it is fantastic for so many invertebrates. And I leave it in my lawn and I'll, sit and watch the pollinators on it.
Oh,
So
brilliant. Yeah, well, I like that diversity. Good answer.
diversity, yeah, I'm afraid there isn't one plant for a meadow, no.
Just before we finish and everybody leaves, I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Can everybody see my presentation?
Yep.
Maybe, can you still see it?
Yes.
Nice. Okay, so yeah, thank you for that talk, Rachel. That was brilliant. How can Nidderdale National Landscape help anybody listening today? Not just you listening, please tell your family and friends if they own a little bit of or manage some grassland. So we, Nidderdale National Landscape, have managed grassland creation, enhancement, restoration projects for the last 15 years. And last year alone, we did 40 hectares of meadows restored and enhanced across Nidderdale. So what's on offer? Well, we can provide soil sampling and vegetation surveys. We can create site-specific management advice that's tailored to your soil types, your aspect, your location, and your needs, what you want from that grassland. We can manage contractors and organise them to come and do the restoration. We can find you donor seed from species-rich wildflower meadows to actually help restore your grasslands. And we can provide, what's really important, ongoing support. We don't just leave you when we've done the restoration. We stay here and we can provide ongoing tailored support years on years after the restoration. And you'll Be glad to know all of this is for free. So if you manage or own a grassland in Nidderdale, please get in touch with me or just generally the Nidderdale National Landscape email address. My email and phone number's there, but our comms officer will send out an email to everybody who's attended this session, and also anybody who bought a ticket but may not have been able to make it today. So all that information will be there, as well as including Rachel's details and how you can sign up to Buglife and be involved in the Beelines project. There are resource sheets available online for the Nidderdale National Landscape website, as well as Buglife. So our resource sheets are focused on grassland creation management for loads of different aspects, whether it's birds of prey, fungi, invertebrates today, or maybe you're starting from the bare bones and you want to create this species rich grassland initially. So if you can go on the Nidderdale National Landscape website, search grasslands in the top right search bar, and you'll be able to find these resource sheets. And we're always constantly updating them with new information that I've been learning as well from these series of webinars. The next session, so join us again on Tuesday the 26th of May, same time, 7 till 8 p.m, and we're going to be looking at how to manage grasslands for Chegdi fungi. Rachel touched on them, talking about wax caps, but there are loads of different grassland fungi, from earth tongs and fan volts to wax caps and clubs and corals. There's some even scarlet caterpillar clubs that actually infect grubs that live in under the ground and then emerge from the body. So really interesting. Your tickets will be available online at the Nidderdale National Landscape website. And sorry, the grassland management for Chegdi fungi will have a guest speaker, Steve Hindle, and he's the fungi guru. He knows everything about them and how to manage these grasslands to help them proliferate everywhere. So feedback's really key. There'll be a feedback form. Please fill that in and send it back. It helps us create content that you want to see, because we want to design these webinars for you. So thank you very much for listening, everybody. It's been great. I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening. I just want to say thank you very much again, Rachel, for that. That was awesome.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you everyone for listening. Hope it was useful.